Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University.
So today I'm with Dr. Richard Ferguson and Dr. Dave Nichols, and we're here to talk about cycling. We discuss what it takes to become a world-class elite cyclist, the interdisciplinary research that underpins performance, and what Loughborough are doing to further research and innovation in cycling. Hi Richard, hi Dave.
Hi there.
Morning.
Before we begin, we often like our guests to provide us with a brief background into themselves. So Dave, can we start with yourself and tell us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I had ambitions when I was younger to become a professional cyclist, and view various injuries and problems. I diverted my career into actually, can I be in the sport but not the one riding the bike? So I'm a Loughborough graduate. I graduated in sports science and exercise physiology masters. I did my PhD in Qatar in the Middle East, so I looked at heat and altitude in performance cycling and what it takes to win and excel in those environments. And off the back of that, I got a job working as a coach in the World Tour, and successfully won 2 Grand Tour stages back in 2018, so a while ago now. And since then, I've returned back to Loughborough, and for the last 5 years, been leading performance cycling at the university.
Thanks, Dave. Sounds impressive. We're going to dig into that a little bit in a moment. And Richard?
Yeah, I'm an academic. I'm a reader in human and exercise physiology. My expertise is in sort of adaptations to training and acute responses to exercise. And we have a real particular focus on cycling in terms of the understanding of performance during cycling and how we can augment the adaptations in well-trained cyclists. My background is in cycling. I've been a cyclist since I was 15, only to the sort of grand scales of 4th category racing in Britain. So I'm an ex-4th cat now. So I'm still going.
Nice. And you're still racing now?
I don't know. Depends how you define racing.
Racing yourself? Are you in competitions?
Well, yes, but no.
At the back, waving.
I'm at the back, or in last place, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it. It's great.
And that is what it's all about. The enjoyment's what it's all about sometimes. We'll move on. So let's get straight into it, really. Let's talk about what it becomes to become an elite world-class cyclist, someone who can compete in the Tour de France. So Dave, you've had some time on tour. So can you tell us about your time on tour and what it really takes to compete at that top level?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the pinnacle of world sport is it's a pretty extreme place to be, and it's high pressure for staff, for riders, and it provides challenges that I think are quite unique in any other business or sport industry, etc. And I found my time working with world-class cyclists to be quite eye-opening. They're odd people, they're freaks, right? They can do things that you look at where I've come from in the sport, and I was a reasonably good cyclist, and I was hanging on to these guys to go out training to go up hills and pull them back, and it's it's pretty eye-opening to see what the limit of human performance can be at the very top end. And I think I'd break down what does it take to become a world-class cyclist. We could probably spend weeks discussing that on a podcast, but there's almost 4 components that I would look at and consider, and that's your physical, technical, tactical, and what I would call the bike speed advantage, some of that fancy technical stuff that we see in British cycling camps and their super round wheels. Physically, it's a sport that you've got to be able to sprint like a 100-meter sprinter at the end of a marathon or longer, and everything in between, and go up hills and run cobbles and in crosswinds. So you've got to excel across a broad range of physical capacities. It's not a closed event. It's very, very open and chaotic and unpredictable. And you've got to be able to be really, really good at loads of different things. And I'd almost look at, from a physical perspective, you often think of sprinters as not particularly good climbers. And they're just really good at popping out at the end and putting their hands in the line. But these are still some of the best cyclists on the planet who would make like amateur and domestic climbers look distinctly slow on climbs. So like you've got these all-round athletes with their specialities at the top end, and it's easy to forget they're actually incredible at lots of different things. That it is remarkable and impressive that they can do those things as well as sprint like a Usain Bolt to the finish line. But I often think, and I think I'm guilty of this in my background in physiology, that we get very hooked up on physical and numbers and data and power to weight and VO2 maxes. And we often forget about those other sides of the sport. Like you've still got to descend high speed, technical mountain descents fearlessly in a peloton of 150 riders. Like, that's not a normal thing to do either.
What kind of speed are they hitting? Because that always amazes me. I've been to the tour and seen some of this, and like the speed that some of them are going at, but then also like how close people are to each other. Like, can you just give our audience, to those who might not know cycling, like some of those numbers of how close are you to that back wheel of somebody, and how fast are you going, and then how quickly do you have to react if something happens? Because we've all seen that the pile-ups.
Oh, for sure. You'd be going easily 100 kilometers an hour plus comfortably, and you might be centimeters from the wheel in front of you. If you're descending through the convoy with the cars off the back, you're literally weaving in and out of cars doing similar speeds. And I've sat in team cars, and that was enough for me in itself. Just let alone being on the bike going.
Protected in a car, thinking this is scary. Let alone you're on a bike out there.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy.
It really is. If you see it live, it's incredible.
I mean, a really good example of that is when Sir Mark Cavendish won his 35th stage the other day, and you had the overhead camera. And at that point in the last 300 meters of the race, they're traveling at 60, 70 kilometers an hour. And that's before he's launched his sprint. And then that overhead camera, you can see how close they were, and they're jostling for places. And it's a nanosecond decision to move to the right of the wheel or to the left of the wheel. And that's the sort of, the difference that makes a world class, beyond world class champion like Mark Cavendish. He made the right decision almost before he made it. Yeah. Took that left side around the wheel and then had a clear run. So it's phenomenal, the sort of, Dave's right, absolutely. It's all about physicality and VO2 max and critical power, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the mental focus and components are equally important for these top class cyclists, suffering for hours and hours. Cav was at the back of the stage throwing up on stage one. Yeah. And then 3 days later he was winning. So it's just, they are freaks of nature, but phenomenal.
Well, many of us who are around any of this, you've seen people, doing the. I've done a Wingate, right? We've all done a Wingate, 30 seconds or a repeated Wingate, and you think you're working hard and you do whatever, you maybe get 5, 6, and you can, me personally, that's it. Legs absolutely gone, can't move, feel sick. Some of these people, what kind of training regimes are they going through to get those kind of levels to be able to do that sprint at the end of a marathon, as you said?
Yeah, I think it in terms of an endurance sport and the demands of that sport, it's quite low impact. So what that means is you're doing a hell of a lot of training volume and soaking up kilometer after kilometer. Like, it would be normal to do 25 to 35 hours a week of training, week on week, year round. Obviously you put in rest periods, you have tapers, etc. on racing. But it is a phenomenal amount of training that's required to do those things. And don't just forget, it's not a one-off, and it's not even a one-off in a one-day race. At a Grand Tour, you're doing repeated hard efforts, sometimes to failure, to max effort, day after day for 3 weeks in the heat at altitude. You've got 2 recovery days in a 3-week Grand Tour. It does require just a hell of a lot of training, and that's not just in 1 year or 2 years, it's decades. It's decades of repeatedly turning up and turning the pedals hours after hours to be able to do those big efforts. And of course, you layer on the intensity and you do some sprint work, but without that huge endurance background and that capability, you won't be contesting the sprint if you're not there. And that's one of the biggest messages that we would share in Loughborough with our students, is training volume is king.
One of the interesting questions, and the question I asked, was around world-class teams on tour. How much is cycling an individual sport, and how much is it a team sport?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I think it depends at what level of the sport you look at as to how to answer that. And I'd focus on road cycling, because ultimately what we talk about, we could go down various different disciplines here. But at an amateur level, cycling looks and feels much more like an individual sport. People do individual training. You race sometimes as a team, but sometimes on your own. And ultimately, if you want to step up and get a professional contract, you need to win bike races. So riding for other people and them to win as a team sport isn't necessarily the way to go to get yourself propelled up the leaderboard and get noticed by teams. And I think as you progress through the ranks, certainly what we're doing at Loughborough, we operate as a team. But at the very professional ranks, your job is to ride for the team. and you have a team car, it's a team race, you're called a team. It's almost, to me, the ultimate team sport, in that you expect and have a role in the team. It might be to ride the first 100 kilometers at 300 watts on the front, and then don't even finish the race, get in the shower and go home, and that's your job done. That's how you're earning your salary. You're actually giving up any chance of success so that your team can win. So at the very top end, and as you turn professional, I think the sport gets more and more driven towards ultimately the ultimate version of a team. And it was really fascinating when Cav won the other day. He didn't say I won and I've won it. He said we've won it. The team won that 35th stage win. And that's what it's about. He had a lead out man, he had people riding on the front, the car and the convoy, the coach, the mechanic fixing his bike. We won that race, not I. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about what sport looks like at the top end, that can often be confused as an individual sport with individual riders succeeding.
And we've seen it in the past, I think, with whether it is a team and who's the leader of the team and who's kind of second, and do they agree with that? And we've seen, historically with some of the British cyclists where there might be breaks in what they should or shouldn't be doing. Do you get that much within those teams? Like, how is that hierarchy decided upon?
Oh, like at elite sport, there are always going to be egos, and there are people who think they should be leading the team and not them. I don't. And ultimately, I think it's about managing the team, and that's true of every single sport. You have the key standout players in football and captains, etc. But you've got to make it about the team's success. And I think that comes from building a high performance culture. And that is all about performance managing and managing people into believing that the team is bigger than the individuals.
And I think, just to add to that, the whole season is usually built around one or two riders and building up to sort of one or two races. So everything is gearing up to that, and they live professionally. So they're all professional athletes, and they would have, 2 to 3 week training camps 3 or 4 times a year at altitude, living away from any family that they have. Then they'd come back, they'd race for a bit, go back to another altitude camp perhaps. So, it's 9 to 10 months a year where they are, completely focused on this one event, for example, the Tour de France. So
yeah, the dedicated. I mean, you started off by calling them freaks, which you meant in the nicest kind of term of endearment type place. And you've talked quite broadly about lots of different things that are going on. So how much does research come into this in terms of understanding the level of performance from individuals and potentially of the team?
Well, I think it's fundamental in cycling as a sport is something that we can capture every heartbeat, every muscle contraction. You get a second by second review of everything that rider does on a bike. So you've collected hundreds of thousands of data points, and that's where the science and the technical side can come in to support your decision making, and you can delve into things that in other sports, if they're trying to capture with performance analysis, like the number of passes or whatever in team sport, that needs coding, needs someone watching it to review it back. There's a huge amount of work that goes into a lot of other sports just capturing what's going on. Whereas by the time I've even got in my house, my Garmin's connected to my Wi-Fi, it's uploaded, and I've got this astronomical amount of data that I can instantly go and play with and understand and look at. So we're in a very fortunate position where we can capture and understand a huge amount of what's going on very, very quickly. And then it's ultimately over to guys like Richard and the researchers to pull together that huge amount of data and understand what's actually driving this athlete forward, what adaptations are we chasing, what happens if we do this. And I think it is a sport where there's lots of measurables. It lends itself to a scientific way of thinking and problem solving. And I'd almost distance myself from saying that we're not here to drive research. We're here to be a high performance cycling team. And that's ultimately what my job is to go and win bike races. But equally, we can support research at the university. And I think that's an important part, in that it's not just about scientists looking at data and telling the performance people what to do. Actually, I might look at someone's training and go, what are they doing? That doesn't make any sense. That's my own bias is saying that shouldn't work, but it does. So it's a two-way street. It's about being informed by research and data and understanding human physiology on that level, but also feeding into the system to say, well, look, that person does this and they're one of the best in the world. So they're either holding themselves back and they could be even better, Or do we need to be a bit more humble and say, perhaps we don't understand this? And can we understand this better by actually observing what's going on and then almost filling in the science behind it?
That's a really interesting point. I remember I did a podcast with Danny Longman about evolutionary biology, and he was saying that when he did one of his crazy world records of rowing across the Arctic, he I think he'd done his masters in physiology, and he was rowing and he was going, I'm like day 5, not slept, and I feel stronger. Like, this physiologically is totally wrong. I don't get it. But that's what led him to research PhD and things like that. So it's just really interesting when you guys can be so kind of close together to go, Richard, your research might say this, but this guy's doing that. What's going on here? And then connecting those dots. It's a really fascinating place to be.
I think it's an absolutely a two-way street. And we, as a researcher, we can spend days and hours and weeks looking down microscopes and doing really interesting blue skies research at the human physiological level and the molecular level. But unless that has a direct impact for the athlete and for Mark Cavendish, Tadej Pogačar, then it's useful, but it's not having an impact. So I learned my lesson over the last 20 years or so to work collaboratively with people like Dave and with teams and with coaches to sort of have my research sort of co-created by them. So we've got our ideas from different perspectives, and we meet somewhere and try and answer those questions. And if we can get some much more fundamental information out of that, then that's of interest. But it's very much, it's got to be impactful. It's got to help the athletes, achieve their goals. So it's multidisciplinary as well. That's the critical thing. We can talk about the physical nature, but it's psychology, it's aerodynamics, it's sort of nutrition and so on. So that has really, over the last 10, 15, 20 years, increased exponentially in terms of our understanding of the performance, sort of basis of cycling.
And where does that sit right now then? So current research that you might be doing yourself linked to cycling, and then if we can take that further afield in and around Loughborough and the practitioners and researchers that we have here, what does that multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach look like as well? So starting with yourself, what research are you doing at the moment?
So I'm very much interested. I mean, this is really through some really excellent PhD students that have come here on the basis of wanting to work here at Loughborough with cycling and those kind of athletes. So one of them is very much on this so-called critical power W prime paradigm. Now, critical power is a very sort of key physiological threshold that when you're riding above your so-called critical power, you're time limited. You will fatigue in a given amount of time, and the higher you are above critical power, the quicker you'll fatigue. So a lot of the riders are probably riding around some threshold power when they're riding up Alpe d'Huez or the Col de Galibier and sort of that final stretch, and they're working to their data. So what that paradigm allows you to do is sort of really understand their performance capabilities, and if you can understand that, you can sort of plan the strategy of the races, whether it's on a climb, you would ride at a certain power, or during a time trial, you would go above critical power for a certain period of time during a sort of climb, a shortish climb. And then when you're recovering on the other side of the hill, or coming down the other side of the hill, you can recover a bit. And that's sort of well planned, it's well modeled, and we understand the physiological principle behind it.
What is it we understand? So this is me going back to undergrad sports science type stuff, so apologies here. But what is it that we're looking at there? Are we looking at physical output, or are we looking at heart rate? So we're looking at, in my head I'm going, well, where's this sit with lactate thresholds and things like that? So can you go into a bit more depth of what this critical power is?
Well, let's not get into a debate now, because there are sort of multiple definitions of lactate threshold. So we're not at a conference today, and let's not have an argument about it. But critical power is one of the key physiological thresholds, and we know that when you're above it, your physiology changes quite dramatically, and it leads to fatigue. And that's well established. We can take muscle biopsies and see what's going on in the muscle and measure blood lactate if you want to, but we know that we can predict it quite accurately. using some mathematical modeling. So, you know, it is one of those real.
What do you guys measure that on, like in the lab, or what do you measure? So it's like watts, like watt by type power output.
Yeah.
And what we're talking there in terms of like how long, because you've got like a peak power. Have we, like, shout at me, tell me I'm wrong, and you know I am the novice here. So what are we talking about in terms of, are we talking how long you can go for 3 seconds or 1 second or 10 seconds? How are we measuring that, and then how do you put that into practice for a training regime, let's say?
Okay, so it's not necessarily your peak power. That's your wing gait. That's your maximal sprint, where you reach maximal power in 1 or 2 seconds, and that's the sort of Mark Cavendish, you know, last bit of the sprint at the end. The critical power is sort of in between your so-called first lactate threshold, but below your maximum power output. So it's that power that you can sustain for a given period of time. And we measure it using cycling tests on a bike, of course, which can be done in the laboratory, and you do a set of sort of fixed duration time trials where you will exhaust at the end and you reach fatigue. Or, as is relevant to the cyclists themselves in the field, you can do it in the field, and you can do it on a road. You find a nice, I mean, what do? They find a nice sort of 5-6% hill somewhere nice in Girona, and do 3 to 12 minute efforts, measure their power using the power meter on the bike, and then you can plot these curves and determine this magical number.
So for those cyclists out there, we all know there's a lot of cyclists out there who might not be at this elite level, but they've all got the data. Yeah. So what is it that they're looking at with this data, and where are these elite cyclists at? So if we're talking kind of wattage, what kind of watts are they hitting for like these periods of time, just to kind of put some perspective of this when we all jump back on a watt bike or our power meters at home to go, oh yeah, these are really good. So where are we at with that?
Oh, it's very, very individual, and obviously between men and women there are differences. I guess on a men's side nationally, you're probably looking 5.5, 5 watts per kilo, that sort of range, and the women's probably 4.5 to 5 at the top end to be competing nationally. But I guess that, like, I bring it to life a little bit. Like, we've just had the national championships a couple of weeks ago in the UK, and that involved a fairly hilly time trial that was about 30 kilometers long. And we were setting pacing plans for our riders, and a lot of that comes off using the critical power model and understanding what is their sustainable power for a given duration. What we knew the duration, but the course itself is not flat, so it's not a constant flatline effort at critical power at all, because you've got to look at aerodynamics and speed relationships, and how to expend your energy. Like Richard said, if you go above critical power, you will fatigue. But there are points on hills or into headwinds where you want to expend a little bit more and go above critical power. And then on the tailwinds or downhills, you recover a little bit and go below the critical power, because that is ultimately what leads to you going the fastest you can. And that's important. We're not training cyclists to do the highest average power on a power duration curve. It's the first one over the line or the quickest one to complete a course. So we are actually focused on speed, not just power. And that's the way aerodynamics, etc., in combination. And we had a race strategy. We had a race plan for each section of the course. You got a radio in the car that you can talk to your rider at, and you say, you know, this section you're going to ride 260 watts, and then get over the top of this hill, push a little bit more on the descent, recover at 240. And you can actually start to really inform almost every single pedal stroke, or certainly narrow down a course into sections and segments to tell the rider and inform them, like, this is what we think is going to produce the fastest speed, to produce this power. And that's all based off understanding their underlying physiology that's either been tested in a lab or in the field. And we have to make concessions and understand, right, because on a time trial bike, you've got your hands really close to the handlebars, you've got a closed hip angle. You're not going to replicate the same sort of sustainable power that you would in a lab sitting upright on a road bike, because you've got differences in biomechanics. It's in the real world, it's different. But we might take what we know from lab testing and transform that into real world stuff. So we might take a few % off. We might go and test it if we're really interested. We might put someone on their TT bike on a similar profile course and go and measure their critical power on that TT bike in that environment. But we can certainly use an awful lot of the training data and the laboratory tests to actually inform what we're doing in preparation for that competition in terms of training powers, training prescription, etc. It's a really, really fundamental tool in prescribing and understanding training.
How much is this kind of slightly random question, but how much are elite level cyclists using the kind of online type, let's just say, tools out there to use it. So from my knowledge, you can basically go and do a Tour de France type ride just on a bike, statically sat in power base. Are elite athletes using that type of stuff to get used to what them gradients could be? Like, how accurate is that kind of stuff at the moment?
Not really. I think it's more like the true elite riders are going out and doing it.
Yeah.
And there's no substitution for going out on the road, riding your bike, doing the miles in the environment that you're going to be racing in. But it's interesting because we've seen a lot of riders have come through COVID and did an awful lot of indoor racing and Zwift, and it really took off and it was become incredibly popular. But you've started to see riders with huge engines who can win front end of Zwift races with massive power to weight, like they're physically incredible. But you can see because they can't ride in the bunch, they can't go around corners. They spend all winter on Zwift because it's raining and no one likes to get wet. So you never learn how to ride a bike in the rain. So as much as it's been fantastic to see new riders coming through and find the sport through a new medium, it comes back to, I think, one of my original points. There's more to cycling than what power you can do. And that tactical and technical awareness can't be forgotten about. Like, it's got to be part of your performance plan.
You answered the question without me asking it, because I was going to say that the data that's surely coming from that, are we getting elite cyclists coming through going, hold on, this person's amazing? You know, are they coming through and then being coached into riding a bike? Is that
100%?
Yeah.
Like, we've seen several pros, and there's the Zwift Academy that's been run by men's and women's professional teams that are about essentially talent ID from indoor training and Zwift racing and performances. And you really can find these people with massive engines who can do a job and ride a bike really, really well. And then it's about coaching them into the sport, and they've got to learn how the sport works, how to ride in the peloton, how to go around corners, etc. But it is impressive to see some of the numbers these people are doing who are relatively new to the sport. Like, they may have picked up cycling during COVID, doing e-racing, and then now all of a sudden there are several World Tour professionals racing at the pointy end of the sport who have come from literally racing in their garage.
That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing, though, isn't it? That you may have a Tour de France winner, let's say, who has actually come from e-racing.
100%.
That's cool. That must be exciting and or challenging around the research kind of base of things as well. And which I know we kind of just talked about critical power and we're looking at that, but earlier on you mentioned about this multidisciplinary approach. So what other research is going on at Loughborough and is beneficial to those cycling teams that might be based here?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a multidisciplinary team across the university, and it's the physical side is as was we've spoken about, pretty important. So nutrition is massive for cycling. They're expending 6,500 calories during a stage. That needs to be replaced during the race, and they're already sort of almost replacing that stores at the end of the race. So carbohydrate feeding, fluid balance, and so on. So we've got a number of expertise here at Loughborough in that space. What are they taking now? 120 grams an hour during hard stages, which was unthought of 10 years ago. So that's the sort of scale that we're talking about. But of course, they have to ride these stages up at altitude, so 2,500 meters, I think, is Col de Galibier height. So there's a environmental stress there in 35 degrees heat. So we have expertise in the environmental ergonomics laboratory, where we can sort of study the sweat rate, the sweat composition of athletes at heat and at altitude, and also the effect that the garments that the cyclists are wearing now. So in the 80s, when I started cycling, it was sort of woolly jerseys. Lycra had just come out, but now they're wearing composite jerseys that sort of reflect the sun but allow the sweat to wick out so that they can keep cool and so on. We've got some research going on that is sort of having a look at some very important and very interesting components of garment technology. Aerodynamics, of course, Dave's talked about that. So we've got colleagues up in engineering. Their day job is designing turbine blades for jet engines, and then they're applying that knowledge to sort of aerodynamics of cyclists and wheels and handlebars and so on. So it spans all components of the physical capacity of the human, the technical and engineering components of the bicycle and garments and apparel, and psychological impacts. We can talk about the physical capacities and critical power, but I think an interesting question that I have, and we're addressing that with a colleague here, Ian Taylor, in psychology, is, you know, what causes the athlete just to stop? You know, their legs are burning, they're ventilating at 200 litres a minute, their VO2 will be through the roof, the blood lactate's coming out of their ears, but something makes them stop, and that is mental. That is the sort of the difference between the motivation to continue and the goal that's being set. So this sort of goal motivation, goal desire, and that's something that we're tackling with at the moment. And you know, the difference between a regular punter like myself and Tadej Pogacar, who can just keep going and going and going without stopping. So, you know, to cut a long story short, it's across all disciplines, and there's pockets of expertise here at Loughborough where we're sort of tinkering with that and doing some really interesting fundamental questions that is applied to the athletes.
Yeah, I just add to that, like, it's such an exciting time for me to be here, because I'm running a cycling team at a university that is almost built to run a cycling team. We've got like these departments in sports and exercise science, and as Richard says, we can do the physiology and the nutrition, and with my background, that's a relatively easy thing to go and tap into. And if we have a complex question, it's just a coffee with Richard, and if he doesn't know, he can tell me someone who does, and we can really solve really quite difficult things quite quickly, and that's almost normal. And that's not a normal thing to be able to do, right? But then it doesn't stop there. Like, there's a sports technology department looking at materials and frame designs and aerodynamics, and there's almost no limit. Like, there's data science and AI and everything that we could possibly want and need to run a really high level cycling team exists and lives on this campus. And I think part of what I've tried to do from running the team is to put those pieces of the jigsaw together and tap into the various areas of expertise and facilities and knowledge, and can that actually drive us forward in what we're doing? And so can we be an example of best practice from the applied research from a multidisciplinary level, and can our cycling team be almost the showpiece of that? This is what cycling can be and how it can be done.
Well, that's basically why this podcast exists in the first place. It was to bridge the gap between academia and professional practice, and it was because some of the coaches here were wanting to find more out about sleep, and they at the time didn't know Professor Morgan, who did research in sleep, and it was like, well, there's a load of coaches here who didn't even realize we're doing this research, and now it's amazing to sit here with you guys going, yeah, I'll just go for a coffee with Richard, and it's like that's where we're in that place where we need to be, where we can have practitioners, researchers chatting, working together.
But we've been doing that for 5 or 6 years. Yeah. So Dave and I were having conversations before he was appointed about how we can integrate, how we can sort of feed off each other. And for the 5 or 6 years that he's been here, we've had, I would say, 3 or 4, maybe 5 projects sort of running, and these are sort of undergraduate projects, postgraduate projects, and PhD projects where we would sit in the coffee shop, we would chew the cud to sort of work out what the problem is, what Dave is trying to ask, and collectively come up with the answer, set the project off and run it. And that's been really productive for Dave. It's been productive for us, and we've presented some of this work at conferences and so on. So it's a no-brainer. We're on it already. Yeah, no, it definitely is. And the concept has been out there for a number of years, but I'm now starting to hear it about the living lab. And people have spoken about a living lab, and you kind of heard it, but actually it seems now that actually people are living it a lot more than just talking about it. And it's happening kind of all over the place. So in terms of cycling, you're working a lot on the Loughborough Lightning women's cycling side of things. So can you tell us kind of more about that, how that's developed, what you're doing now, and why this is kind of really, really important?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating 5 or 6 years since I've started at the university, and that's where I'd probably start by answering you, in that I was appointed to this role to create a performance cycling team or centre that had never previously existed. So it was a student-run club, it was a student club when I was here, and it's always been students organising rides, going out and doing their thing, and as you would find at any other university in most sports that people do. And I guess that Loughborough appointing someone, happened to be me, to come in, was to say, well, actually, can we do cycling better at university? And what was really interesting to me was that there was no template. No one's really ever done it. It's almost an empty space to say, I think Loughborough's got the infrastructure, the facilities, the staff, the research to do something really significant. How can we tap into that, and how can we build it? So I started what's now called the Loughborough Cycling Academy back in 2019. We created this thing. And it really started as quite a small scale, low budget program where we had a handful of riders and not a huge number of staff to come and support cycling, basically, get us off the ground and figure out how we're going to kickstart this and get the ball rolling. And it really became a training center. So when I started, there was no Lightning team, there was no race team. It was a training center where I appointed some student volunteer coaches from School of Sport to come in and help me like manage the riders and coach them, part-time nutritionist and a part-time physiology student. And we started as this really small little team, but it was starting to create an actual training offer. And we'd compete at Bucks events as a university, but none of the riders were actually representing Loughborough out at national level cycling. It wasn't their team because we didn't have a team. It really operated as an environment that people could come in, get their coaching, get their nutrition, get their S&C, develop as a person behind the scenes. But we were sending those riders out into race teams to go and represent someone else. And after two or so years of doing that, it was getting a little bit frustrating, right? Because you'd see our riders going and winning races and being celebrated by national press in cycling and seeing it on Twitter and the teams getting the credit for it because they're wearing someone else's jersey. And actually we're like, but those teams are just bringing them, they're just turning up to the race. Okay, they're doing a job, they're setting out the tactics, they're giving them their food, but we're doing this hell of a lot of work behind the scenes for our riders to grow and develop and progress. And no one's really talking about it. Like it's all shown by the teams that are winning the races, not us. So that was the transition where we looked at what Loughborough was doing, and there's obviously a fantastic Lightning franchise already existing. And cycling seemed to really fit that model of almost a semi-professionalization of the sport, where we had an opportunity to compete at national level within the university. And it really kick-started what the team was. And at the same time as those conversations, British Cycling announced a new tier of structure within domestic cycling with an elite development team that laid out that you have to have like a team car, you've got to have a certain budget, you've got to have some people to run your team and a few benchmarks that we were just short of when I set out the vision for creating a women's cycling team. And thankfully that got the support from the university, and off we went. We met the criteria and launched the team in 2021, actually e-racing because there was still no racing going on. But we launched it as an elite development team, and that really kick-started cycling at Loughborough. And the team has grown year on year. There's now something like 12 members of staff or 13 members of staff working in cycling. They're employed. We moved from volunteer student coaches into employed coaches. A lot of the roles became professional roles, not intern roles, etc. And the budget's increased, and we're now able to really compete and grow the team to a national level. And actually, this year we were leading the National Road Series with one of our riders, which, I mean, 4 years ago when we started the team, I was borrowing gazebos from the events team if they were available, and we didn't even have chairs to sit on in car parks at bike races, right? So in a relatively small period of time, we've grown from a very, very small team that was just starting out and saying, well, how can we move on to have riders representing Loughborough and in our jersey, to actually now being able to say, look, we've led the National Road Series as the Premier League of domestic cycling. It's been a really cool journey in the growth and development of what we're doing, and hopefully we can continue that. And like, we're not finished, and we want to continue to grow and support the team over the next 5 years and see where we can get to.
And what does that look like on the cyclist side of things? So how many kind of elite development female cyclists do we have as part of the team or coming through? And let's do, like, what does their day-to-day look like in terms of this development? And then, and it's 3 questions in one, which you should never do, but then how does the research and this all fit together to make it happen? So over you go.
Yeah, so I guess on the Lightning side, we've got a squad of about 14, and half are students. So half are non-students who we've actively recruited to race for us nationally, like the Lightning franchise allows, and half are current students studying at the university. On the men's side, so we still run a men's side of the academy. It's just not a race team. So we offer the same level of background support, the coaching, etc. But they're still not racing for the university. That's something that I'd like.
Is that still frustrating?
It's frustrating, but look, hopefully in the future we'll be in a position to be able to run a men's and women's elite team. from Loughborough. What does their day-to-day look like? Well, like it's so varied on the time of the year and like the racing cycle, but also we've got to remember they're student athletes. They are not just people who are professionals who can got unlimited time to ride bikes and recover, etc. So we have to be really conscious of that. The winter is mostly about high volume, lots of training, lots of S&C, lots of that physical preparation so that they're in the best possible condition to go racing in the summer. But alongside that, we've got exams in January, and December's always coursework deadlines, and it comes to Easter and they panic. And so we have to be really, really careful and plan in advance when we're going to run squad sessions. And we can't put a squad session on during exams because no one's able to turn up, for example. So it really varies, and it also varies by age group. Like some of our students coming in at 18 could not tolerate the same training load as someone in their mid-20s who's been doing it for the last 15 years. So we treat every single athlete individually. We give everyone prescribe their own training plans. Everyone has their individual coaching, and that's really important to what we do. But at the same time, a huge part of it is the opportunity that I think only we have to actually bring everyone together. And when you think about how cycling teams operate, they're normally based. They're not based centrally. So a team manager might live somewhere, but the riders live all over the country, potentially Europe. I mean, in the World Tour, I only lived in the same country as two of the riders I coached. So it's a sport where it's really hard to bring people together. And they come together on race day, they do the race, and then they go home. And actually, we've got an opportunity through the creation of a facility and cycling hub and a centralisation of staff to not just treat riders as individuals, but actually how do you build a high performance culture and an environment, and how do you bring people together to feel part of the team that we spoke about? It's a team sport. And I think that's what we're doing really successfully, in that we will run group sessions, and it might not be the optimal training that someone had to do individually that day, but the actual total benefit of being around riders, riding together, learning skills, being in the bunch, doing race simulations, that is so hard to do outside of racing unless you have an environment where you can pull people together. And so that's really where our focus has been.
I think it sounds really interesting, especially from what we did talk about at the start around individual or team. And actually, we've got this unique environment where you can create both an individualized team environment. Sounds, really exciting for the future of it. Am I right in thinking that, and this is the case in a lot of research where I've spoken to people in physiology, that much of the research that's been done historically has been on males? And how are we trying to kind of move that forward regarding a female elite team?
Well, yeah, for sure. And I think it's not just that the research is typically done in males, it's done in male university students. Right? And people like me, like I know full well, because as a student, I volunteered for an awful lot of studies, and my physiology is published in various different journals. And actually, what's really interesting, when I presented some data from my time in the World Tour, I actually did a recce, or a preset run of a task I'd given one of our riders, which was I set up a little gazebo with heaters in the service course in Italy. I blew all the fuses, which I wasn't the most popular guy that day with all these fan heaters set up, but I got it really, really hot, really humid, and I had a set power, and I was riding at it. And I'm not a bad cyclist. I'm no longer racing, but I'm reasonable, and I stay fit and active. And I got 40 minutes into my little test, and I had to stop. I had to go outside and douse myself down in the hose because I was absolutely boiling, and I just couldn't continue. It was Ben King at the time. I gave him the same thing to do because he was preparing for a hot Vuelta. It was starting in southern Spain. It was going to be high 30s. So we really needed to capture some of his heat physiology and how we were going to adapt him to the heat. And he cruised through it. It was like the easiest. It was almost too easy. And I didn't measure anything because he could just tolerate it. And it was just a normal day out for him riding the bike. And it made me think, like, the research that's been done is actually on people like me, not freaks like him.
Yeah.
Right. So how do we better understand the physiology of world-class athletes when an awful lot, and certainly females, when an awful lot of research is done on not world-class athletes, students like me in physiology labs? And I think that's a huge challenge. And hopefully Richard can come in here to how can we address that gap?
I think it's quite funny, just as you said that. So do you both know James Morton?
Yes.
Yeah, so I was an undergrad student with James, so we were in the same football team and course at university, and I was part of his undergrad altitude chamber on a bike training regime. I can't remember how long it was, but yeah, I was part of that. And he's gone on to do work in and around the tour, I think, hasn't he? So yeah, I thought that's quite funny.
Yeah, he's gone to very senior positions at some of the major teams. So he's a leading light in terms of sort of that applied work, particularly in nutrition.
Might have to get him on and just say it was all based on an altitude training regime that I did with him as an undergrad.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, going back to the main point, it's a huge gap. There is a huge gap in our knowledge base of the female athlete. There's no doubt about it. And I was at a conference 2 weeks ago in Florence at the start of the Tour de France. It's the sort of annual science and cycling conference where there's a good load of high quality academics there, and a lot of the World Tour team performance scientists, performance directors go. It's a great forum, and one of the keynote lectures was from the performance scientist of the women's FDJ team, and it was a really good presentation. But it just highlighted that there is a huge gap in our knowledge of the female athlete and the female cyclist. And as Dave said, we're all guilty of it. We have these strange reasons for not recruiting females, which we're overcoming now, and well. It's not even a barrier now, but it's pretty significant. So where we're at the moment, and we're in a fortunate position here in Loughborough, and there are UK-wide sort of pushes for this to really enhance the sort of women in sport agenda, particularly from a research and innovation sort of perspective. So fairly recently as well, it's still being developed, and the program of work is still being borne out, but there will be a women in sport health and well-being hub here at Loughborough. So I don't know much more about it. It's still being designed by Emma Pullen and all the colleagues across the university, and women in sport is a major university strategic goal. We have to up our knowledge base and work on that. So as an outcome of that, we've had a sort of small PhD cluster. So 3 or 4 PhD students are being appointed in this Women in Sport Health and Wellbeing cluster. And fortunately, last Thursday, we interviewed an excellent cohort of applicants, and we've appointed a student and a PhD student, and their PhD will be looking at, very specifically the fundamental effects of the menstrual cycle on performance. I won't get into the details because we're still, sort of unpacking the research plan, but it really is to sort of have an in-depth, investigation of the menstrual cycle effect on performance, but crucially, it's linking it to cycling. We've got a really good student who is some good networks in professional cycling, so she's going to be able to cover, address, co-create these experiments and this body of work to really answer the questions. But more needs to be done. This is scratching the surface.
I really look forward, because hopefully speaking to them in the future, because our most successful podcast so far is literally about the menstrual cycle and women athletes, and I think there's loads more, as you said, loads more research that needs to be done in this space. So we've got the Women in Sport research hub that's coming along. So Dr. Emma Pullen is pushing that forward. Again, we'll be pushing more things with her. But what's next for you guys? So what's next for you, Dave, with the cycling hub at Loughborough?
Yeah, I think it's really exciting time for us to really push on, and we are leading the university cycling scope in the UK. I think it's fair to say that we do have the best setup going, but we're still figuring out how to be really competitive nationally and internationally, and actually can we push the sport on to another level and set ourselves apart from university sport to actually say we're going to really crack on at that semi-professional, national, international level. So look, a lot of that is going to come down to finances, and we need to attract sponsorship. We need money ultimately to move the team up a level. It's a travelling circus, a cycling show. We
freaks, as you put it.
Yeah, freaks. We have football stadium into the back of the van every week, and we drive off to various locations around the UK and Europe, and then we unpack and set everything up, and everyone's got to travel and accommodation and race fees, etc. Like it comes with a huge logistical challenge as not being a facilities-based sport. Our facility is the open countryside of the world. And that's where we go and practice our art, and that's where we compete. So look, it costs money, and we can't pretend that we can go out and compete with teams with £1 million budgets on 10% of that, for example. So that is a huge challenge, and I think that's currently, we've got to the point that we're probably at the level we can be at based on what we're currently doing. I think we recruit well, we perform well, we train our athletes well, and we're generally competitive at national level sport. But if we want to step up and step on, then we need to grow our background offer again and take another step change from where we've been.
Well, hopefully there's someone who knows some sponsor out there who's listening who's gone, actually, this sounds like quite a unique opportunity for a cycling team to be based, because we've talked, extensively really about the amount of research and practice that comes together, and all of those different pieces that Richard mentioned earlier that can really combine to make this happen. So over to you, Richard.
I mean, it's an absolute unique opportunity, that. So, we've got a semi-professional, nearly semi-professional cycling team, and high quality, world leading research, multidisciplinary research that is willing and able to support the ambitions of that cycling team. So I think, it's an absolute no-brainer, particularly in the female in sport paradigm as well, where we need to know a lot more. So it really is, an exciting opportunity.
Definitely. I was just thinking it's opportunity time. So in terms of research and innovation, Richard, I know you had kind of, I'm going to call it a year out, and I know that's not what really it is. That was just what was in my mind.
No such thing as a year out in academia. Come on.
You've been drinking coffee and thinking about these things for the last year. So you've been working a lot on cycling research. So what is it that's happening next for kind of the Centre for Cycling Research and Innovation? What's your plans with that?
So yeah, my year out, as it were, was really to sort of get an idea of what the university does across pan university in cycling related research and innovation. And surprisingly, the work that is done transcends what the university can do. In my audit, you could see that in every academic department, every academic school, there was something that was cycling related in terms of research and innovation. And Dave and I have been talking about the human being and the physiological sort of determinants of performance. We've talked about the engineering and aerodynamics and how that can impact on cycling performance. And there's of course pockets of work in that. Well, large amount of work, but it goes beyond that. Cycling is an elite sport. It's a very popular sport, but we can cycle to work. We can cycle for transport. So there's a whole body of work that's done across various schools in architecture, in the design school and so on, which is about infrastructure, policy and society. There's a huge net zero challenge to us, and cycling will sort of contribute to that challenge to reach net zero. So there's all sorts of opportunities in that sphere where we can sort of direct the research and innovation, and there's already pockets of it there, and huge grants that are going in to fund this work. So the proposal for a Centre for Cycling Research and Innovation, it's still a proposal. We're developing a business plan at the moment, developing the links and the strategic partnerships with British Cycling, with local councils, with Active Travel England, and various other sorts of entities in cycling. Some of them are based on campus. Sport England are up the road here on Sport Park. Active Together is up here on Sport Park. So we've got a really unique opportunity to have a multi-transdisciplinary approach to support cycling.
Now there's people everywhere here on campus that can support all elements of that, and I just pulled this off my desk around what our research themes and the strategy of the university. So sport, health and well-being, and
tick.
Yeah, literally going to say tick. Like you tick the box in cycling for this. Climate change and net zero, tick. And then vibrant and inclusive communities.
Tick. We need more sort of diverse communities, workers, sort of delivery riders, policies around them, because they're all cycling around. And so there's so much that we can do. So we've ticked all three of those.
It's brilliant. It's been amazing talking to you both, because we started talking about the elite level of cycling, and we've touched upon some of those really exciting and kind of really hardcore approaches to cycling, and whether that be, your physiology is always going to kind of dominate, I think, in this space when we talk about it, but there's a lot more to it, like going down a hill at 100 kilometers an hour, the psychology behind that, and then you talked about nutrition, we've talked about heat, we've talked about engineering, all these different things that come together. But the excitement sits in, Dave, what you've done in terms of going, right, we're going to do something different here. We're going to develop an elite cycling team. And actually, there's a real passion for this in the women's sport era. And where can we go with this, and the level that we're currently at, and where can we go next? And then, Richard, you've come in and talked about all this research that actually it's not just about elite cycling. There's so much of this that can help change society and change for the future. And I think we're in a really exciting place with the university strategy, with the support that you're both getting. And hopefully we can move this space forward in the future to have the forefront of research in cycling and performance in cycling, when we sit down again with your PhD student who's going to do some game-changing things with the menstrual cycle, and hopefully we'll be in an even better place in the next 12 months or a few years.
Yeah, I think, like, for me, I see the cycling team and the performance side of it is like this shiny little sexy thing that everyone looks at and goes, oh cool, like Loughborough's competing at international, like maybe the Tour de France Femmes one day. But actually what underpins that is a cycling team that represents a vehicle for sustainability, for net zero, for staff cycling to work, for public health, for people riding bikes. And to me, that's so appealing. And I think Loughborough is the university that's set up to do that. And our cycling team can showcase everything that is great about research and innovation at Loughborough.
Yeah, it's brilliant, guys. It's been an absolutely pleasure talking to you both, and I hope anybody who's listening out there, so Dave, if there's any sponsors out there, come and contact Dave. He's willing to take your money to move things forward, and any researchers who want to collaborate, want to come and speak to Richard in all those fields we've just spoken about, come and speak to him
and fund some research as well.
Yeah, always money's always welcome. But no, thanks again, guys. Really been good speaking to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's great.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@alborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.